And we will begin our Hot Politics Lab session today with Professor Mark van Vugt. Mark is a professor in evolutionary psychology, work and organizational psychology at our neighboring university, Vrije Universiteit. And I know Mark mostly from his research on leadership. He's also a blogger. So if you want to read about psychology, evolutionary psychology, go to Psychology Today and read his entries. He's also an author of books that have really flowery titles, so I can read a couple of them to you. For example, one of my favorite, F's Sapiens, What Does Football Tell Us About Human Behavior? Another one, Lucy, Darwin and Lady Gaga. And the one that is in English, Mismatch, How Our Stone Age Brain Deceives Us Every Day and What Can We Do About It? Mark is also a senior associate editor of the Leadership Quarterly, maybe a journal that is of interest to some of you as well. So we are very happy to have Mark today and hear his talk on welfare, weather and wealth. Again, a great title.
Yeah, well, alliterations. Yeah.
So we have around 30-45 minutes for the talk and then the rest for discussion.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, Honorata. It's nice to be here. Obviously, the Hot Politics Lab, where you bridge political science and psychology, which is also close to my heart. So really honored to be here. So my talk is about leadership ideals. What kind of leaders do we have in our minds as being ideal in what kind of situation? And so I think it's partly psychology, a little bit of evolutionary psychology, but also cultural psychology in here. I want to start with a brief story. This is a story that probably you all know. It's a competition and conflict between the city-states, Athens and Sparta, two very different political systems, as you may know. Athens, a democracy, more or less, where arts and literature flourished and philosophy, obviously, outward looking in some ways, and a political system that was more or less, well, I said that already, a democracy. And then compare it to Sparta, very different political system, not a democracy as such, but an oligarchy headed by kings, more or less, hereditary kings, a military state. And the reason why I use these examples is because they are very different political systems, but within one sort of bigger region. And that's interesting. And why is that? Well, lots of different explanations, obviously, of why that may be so. But one explanation is in the ecology. So Athens is sea bordering, has a lot of wealth derived from trading, is outward looking. Sparta is landlocked, lives mainly of agriculture, and has a military system that actually allows it to capture the agricultural lands of neighboring areas if they are facing some sort of food shortage or whatever. So maybe there is something in the ecology that shapes political systems. So I think that's a sort of nice introduction in what I would like to say. That's this paper about, and my colleague has done a lot of work on this, Sirio Lonati, you may know him, he's the Neoma Business School, and he's an economist, more or less. So this paper, Ecology, Culture and Leadership, is basically an extended version of what I will be presenting today. So is there any variation in leadership ideals? That's, of course, the first thing that we have to establish, and there is. So this is a scale that taps into the variation between countries in whether they see as an ideal leader somebody who's more participative or somebody who is more authoritarian. They see that as a sort of opposition. And so the darker the regions, the stronger the preference for participative leadership. I'll come later on how that is measured, because that's through the globe data.
Just one question for clarification. Is this specifically about political leadership or more in general?
More in general. I'll give, well, I think I deleted the slide. Okay, so the question is, it's from the Globe Cross-Cultural Project. These data are actually available to anyone. And the question is, what makes an outstanding leader in your organization or industry? It's not so much about national leadership, but people have sort of made the jump that it also says something about national leadership prototypes. But hey, that's an empirical question. Anyways, this is so there is variation. I mean, you can argue how big the variation is because this is on 7-point scales and it's sort of roughly between, what is it, 4.5 and 5.9. So, but anyway, but there is variation. So it's interesting where that comes from. So as a sort of psychologist and leadership scholar, I'm interested in these implicit leadership theories, the kind of concepts or templates we have in our minds about what makes an ideal leader, which of course can be driven by many factors. I mean, socialization, individual experiences, genetics, and maybe deeper evolutionary forces and ecology. So they're culturally shared expectations about the traits and behaviors of an ideal leader. Of course, once you have cultural leadership prototypes that also differ between cultures, you get between group differences, and they determine probably who emerges as leaders. So there is a link between what implicit leadership theories people have and who they vote for example, in an election. And the question is this across domains? So that's, I think, a really open question, which I'm not tackling here today, but that's interesting. So if there is a cultural leadership prototype in the Netherlands, does it apply to the politicians that we vote, but also the CEOs that we have, or the priests, or whatever? And so, again, we don't know that yet. I don't know that, at least. Maybe you do. So some questions that we ask in this paper is, why is there cultural variation? And can we explain these CLIs, cultural leadership ideals, in terms of deeper evolutionary and ecological forces? How are they being transmitted? So that's a really interesting question about social influence, essentially. And can they change? As ecologies change, maybe do these CLIs also change with them? Or are they more inert? And finally, how can we study these CLIs dynamically and make predictions about shifts and changes? Any questions so far? Okay, so the cultural perspective, I pretty much borrow from the GLOBE project. That's been sort of ongoing survey for maybe 40 years now, I think, with, I think, 5 times they have administered this survey. And the idea was, I mean, back in the 1980s, globalization really took off. People were migrating for work, etc. And so there was an interest in, hey, if I'm now working in Japan, what does that mean in terms of the kind of managers that I have and the kind of work that I have to do and how it is structured, etc. So there was an interest in these cross-cultural aspects of leadership. And so these people went out across many different societies. In the first round or wave, there were about 62 countries they sampled, and increasingly there's more and more. And the last bit was actually done last couple of years, but I haven't seen the results yet. They haven't been made public to my awareness yet. But so there is a last round, which was done very recently in more countries than 60. And so they were interesting. What is the ideal of a leader in, as I said, industry or in an organization? What makes an outstanding leader? Oh yeah, this is actually the question. I didn't delete the slide after all. Okay, so it's a 7-point scale. This behavior characteristic greatly inhibits a person from being an outstanding leader, to contributes greatly to a person being an outstanding leader. And then you have a host of different traits. So this is how it's measured. And then you get a lot of things that across societies people value in their leaders. I mean, not surprisingly, on the left side, honest, decisive, intelligent, whatever. There's also some traits that are universally disliked, also not that surprising. Being a loner, dictatorial, ruthless, whatever. But of course, most interesting for my story is where the variation is. And is there variation? Well, there is. I mean, these are just some examples. For example, there's variation in how much people value a risk seeker as a leader, how much they value somebody who's modest, humility in a leader, autonomy, visionary, and paternalistic. These are just some of the traits. And they have been linked to, which you're probably familiar with, Hofstede's cultural dimensions. So they may tell you something about whether somebody like Elon Musk, in what countries he would prefer it as a leader. Well, maybe yes, in the sort of Anglo-American world where risk-taking is considered to be, or entrepreneurship, great value in a leader, but maybe in an East Asian country that may not necessarily be the case. I mean, is there an equivalent of Elon Musk in Japan? I'm not sure. You may know, but
SoftBank.
okay.
I don't know his name though, but he is someone who invested massively in companies like this actually.
Right.
It's been spectacularly wrong.
But is he so outspoken? Can you be a leader in Japan if you're not humble and?
No, it's hard to say. I don't know enough.
Yeah.
But this was just a candidate.
Yeah. Very interesting. But that sort of begs the question, where does these cultural dimensions come from? And that's the sort of thing that we want to tackle in this paper and in the research that we're doing. So where do these CLIs really come from? Because culture doesn't just fall out of the sky. It's shaped by something. And a good candidate for us is ecology. So how does this work? Here I'm deriving from my own work on evolutionary leadership. So the assumption is that we have an adaptive follower psychology. So we have in our minds a heuristic that tells us, hey, in this case, I want to follow a leader and I want to follow that leader. And that has been shaped, that's our argument, at least through hundreds of thousands of years, through many generations, and passed on in the sense of evolved psychological mechanisms. So, and they work a little bit like these input-output systems that you may be well familiar with. You have cues from the environment. For example, you find yourself in a dangerous environment, threats of predators, conspecifics who want to kill you. You have in your mind then a follower mechanism that is activated, because if there is a threat of predators, outgroups that want to harm you, you seek protection from someone, from your group, from your leader, etc. And then the output is that you endorse somebody who protects you. For example, somebody is physically strong. You may say, well, does that still work in our society today? This is what we try to tackle in our book, Mismatch. We say, yes, this still works in our society today, and not just in humans, because we and others have done quite a bit of work comparing different species, mammals, for example, who have leadership, and they seem to follow the same kind of decision rules. They hide behind a strong individual in case of threat. You see that in elephants, you see that in zebras, you see that in meerkats, you see that in chimps, and you see that in humans. So, but I'm not going to talk about all that. You can read that anyway. Okay, so we have these evolved followership mechanisms that work as sort of mental algorithms. This is standard evolutionary psychology. I don't know how familiar you are with that, but they're sort of fast and frugal heuristics. They pop up quickly, almost automatically. Doesn't have to be, but usually does. And they're context specific. And this is really very crucial about evolutionary psychology, because people often say, oh yeah, this is about determinism or something like that, people all over the world have the same thing and do the same thing. Yes, maybe so, but it's a context-specific theory, evolutionary psychology. It says in adaptively relevant situations, when that situation is activated, it activates a certain mental algorithm that helps you solve a particular problem to your survival reproduction. But what the problem is varies, of course. And that is why the context is very much a core part of any evolutionary psychological theory. But our mental algorithms are shaped over many generations. And as our environments may quickly change, these mental algorithms may not necessarily produce adaptive outcomes anymore. And we see that with our food intake. That's a classic example of a mismatch. Our ancestors were always low on calories, so they took in what they could. But of course, now we can load ourselves up with calories without having to spend calories. And we're not running after a gazelle or whatever anymore. We just go with our trolley to the Albert Heijn. And so the problem, the outcome is obesity and all these kind of modern Western lifestyle problems. Anyways, okay, so how does this work? So again, I say any evolutionary psychological theory is context specific. And there's really good evidence for that. And the sort of bigger theoretical framework derived from evolutionary biology is what we call behavioral ecology. Is anyone familiar with human behavioral ecology as a field? Okay, so the assumption is that different ecologies produce different adaptive traits and behaviors. And that could happen even at the phenotypical level. So you have this sort of concept, what is called adaptive phenotypic plasticity, which is a property of a genotype, your DNA, etc., to produce a different phenotypes depending on different ecological conditions. You have these grasshoppers. They're all the same species, but they have a different phenotype, a different color, as you can see. Some are green, others are brown. It's the same DNA, same species, but they find themselves in a different environment. So the green grasshopper happens to be born in a grassland environment. And as a result, he develops a green phenotype. The other grasshoppers, same species, find themselves in a sandy environment. Green is not the right phenotype because you're picked off by any predator easily. So you develop a brown phenotype. Same DNA, find yourself in different ecological conditions, so you develop different adaptive responses, strategies, physical properties, etc. That's a really well-known finding in evolutionary biology. That also applies to cultures and maybe also to leadership ideals. That's then our claim. And then you say, well, different ecological conditions. We're all Homo sapiens. We all have the same DNA, more or less, the same mental algorithms. But we find ourselves in different situations, ecologies, with different challenges. And that produces different phenotypes, different cultures, different ways of getting around, socializing, personality, the whole set, including leadership and followership. Do you follow that argument? Because that's quite crucial for the rest of what I'm going to say. Okay, so we know, and there's been a lot of recent interest in this idea of ecology drives psychology. This is a paper in Proceedings of the Royal Society, came out in 2023. It's sort of a review of everything, every sort of psychological trait, behavior, whatever, anything we're interested in as psychologists, being predicted by a host of ecological factors. And these are some of the factors that are in this review. So there are some of them are more related to social ecology, like GDP, life expectancy. Others are more related to the physical environment, like disease threat. How easily can you get killed by the flu, for example, or any other infectious disease? Gini, rainfall, population density. I mean, you can argue about what exactly constitutes ecology, because you can have a very broad view or a narrow view. And I think this is really open to debate. And I'm not quite, I mean, I tend to be a little bit on the sort of conservative side by just looking at what animal behavior ecologists have listed as ecological properties. But for example, like Gini, is that really about ecology, or is it a consequence of ecology? I mean, rainfall, temperature, you could say, yeah, maybe infectious diseases, yes, but unemployment, I'm not so sure. Anyway.
Mark,
Yes.
I'm not familiar with the paper, but are they include, these are bivariate correlations, or I mean, just thinking life expectancy is probably a consequence of some of these other.
Yeah, correct. So, yeah, that's, so where is it in the sort of, in the causal chain?
Yeah.
So I think you can argue about that, but they have all assumed that this list, they see as the ecological condition.
Yeah.
And life expectancy, you could sort of say, okay, yeah, is it a consequence? Yeah, maybe, but it also drives something, because if you live in an area with many threats, people are not going to get very old. So it's also a sort of. But anyway, but I'm not vested. I'm not fixed on the list so much of these social ecological indicators. So, but that's really, I think, a good criticism on that. But I mean, by and large, what they find is really, for some traits at least, quite strong predictors of ecology. Variation in personality, for example. You wouldn't think of that ecology would matter so much, what percentage of introverts or extroverts there are in society, or how conscientious people are. And yet they do find that across many different studies in this bigger review. I don't have the paper right in mind, but there is also some variation in what the best predicting ecological variables are. You can read upon that yourself. But the main message here is that, hey, ecology influences a host of psychological variables. And we know that, of course. You know, probably this book, Jared Diamond, he is one of the first, although, of course, he's also standing on the shoulders of many other giants who claim that ecology influences human behavior. Has anyone read this book by any chance? Actually, one of his sort of more specific theories has more or less been refuted in a recent paper. I don't know if you saw that. That's on the east-west axis, and how behavior is more similar from east to west in the world than from north to south, because of geographical borders and all these things. But I mean, the ideas of his ecological theory are, I think, pretty well established, that things like climatic factors, natural disasters, the availability and predictability of resources, subsistence technology, all those factors, that they somehow do shape culture and psychology. And in the book, he comes with lots of narratives about those kind of relationships. So we can take then that list of ecological factors and say, okay, we have, for example, the globe data set. We have, from the nations that are in this globe data set, the 60 odd nations, we have a host of different ecological factors. Can we now make predictions as to how leadership ideals vary between ecologies? Well, one of the first attempts was done by a colleague of ours, who's now a retired professor, because he came up with this, what's called climato-economic hypothesis. So again, he used the globe data set, and he looked at in what nations an authoritarian or an autocratic leader is seen as ideal. And he established, or he found, this sort of interaction effect, where he said, well, a demanding bioclimate, which is operationalized in terms of harshness, sort of low rainfall, high temperature, and also a lot of variation in temperature across the year. So sometimes it's very high, other low, or high, low. Think about like a desert kind of thing or whatever. And so, but there's no main effect, as you can see. It's not like the harsher the climate, the more authoritarian the leadership is. No, he said, well, looking at those data, found an interaction, said, well, yeah, that maybe applies to poorer countries, countries that don't have a lot of wealth. Whenever they don't have the resources maybe to deal with the harsh climate, and so they invest in a authoritarian leader. But he said that's not the case, clearly, in societies that have a lot of wealth. They have the resources. And so how do they deal with harshness of climate? Well, by maybe innovation, technology, or being open, being whatever. So I think, yeah, is there something to say for this? Yeah, more or less. I mean, I think the mechanisms you can argue about, but this was one of the first studies that we could find that looks at it very systematically. Now the other, so I was editing a special issue on the evolution of leadership, and Serial submitted this paper, and I thought, blimey, this is interesting. Again, he used the GLOBE data set and used this sort of measure of participative leadership, the one that I showed you earlier. The darker blue is sort of more preferences for more participative leaders. And so the lighter is preference for more authoritarian, autocratic leadership, the lighter the society. And he linked that to a data set on agricultural intensity. And so the hypothesis that he tested through this study, and he's an economist, so he used a lot of very complex statistical analysis with lots of controls to get rid of confounds, etc. And I was pretty persuaded when he presented this very long paper that there was still this relationship. And the idea is that the more intense a country depends on agriculture, the stronger the preference for an authoritarian leader. And then you, of course, ask yourself, why? Why? Okay, so this is where we come in as sort of psychologists and political psychologists. Sort of, okay, what is then? So there's various theories, and of course the theories you cannot test with these data. You need, of course, experiments, surveys, whatever. But the argument is as follows, and actually the argument, more or less, Jared Diamond already coined to some extent. So the idea is that countries that moved from a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, or pastoralist lifestyle, to agriculture, what those societies needed was planning. Of course, because what you need with agriculture, you need to plant seeds and then watch them grow, and then half a year later you can harvest. So you need planning, control, protection, because anyone can destroy your land while you're growing your potatoes, whatever. You need redistribution of food resources so that in winter times there's also enough food to hand out when all the fields are not growing anymore. And this all points towards centralization. Centralization of authority. Centralization of political, what is it? So that's sort of one hypothesis about this relationship. And I thought, yeah, that's interesting. And these are, again, that's why it's interesting. This is data from current societies based on the agricultural intensity that maybe started like 2,000 years ago in some places. So why is Russia so authoritarian? Well, hey, maybe because they invested a lot of agriculture, because land needs to be protected. You needed to have a police force, maybe an army. You needed to have a strong leader who redistributes the food when it's needed, etc. Maybe, anyways. So I was very interested in that, and then we did ourselves a number of studies. I'll also discuss a little bit the work with Honorata. The idea that another ecological factor may be intergroup conflict. It's more like a social ecological factor, but this intergroup conflict also changes leadership ideals. And we have this paradigm where half of the people get to see a war scenario, the other a peace scenario, and who do they then vote for as their ideal president? And we do that with faces, but we do it also with traits. And by and large, what we find across many different studies in many different societies now, there's a masculine or a preference for a more dominant looking leader in conflict, masculine, in war, whereas in peace, it switches to a more feminine looking leader. And that's not just about leadership, not about face preferences, because if we ask for trait preferences, then there's also in conflict a more dominant leader, whereas in peace, a less dominant or warmer leader, generally speaking. Again, we have also done that with these American presidential elections, where we morphed the face of, for example, Trump, to make him look more feminine or masculine. We gave different scenarios, war or peace. And again, by and large, in the war scenario, they chose for this Trump, and in the peace for that Trump. Even though people are not aware of exactly, because it's between subjects design, so they don't exactly know what they're doing. And with Hillary, you can do the same. Okay, so again, I said, Honorata, you're also on this paper with the cross-cultural.
The lead phase, right? That's the
the
lead phase project.
Yeah, the lead phase project. Okay, so we've done this sort of conflict dominance hypothesis. We tested that in various societies with various data collection collaborators, with faces of hypothetical leaders that were adjusted to the society where we sampled from. So from the African nations, the East Asian and the Caucasian. And this is basically the differences between the war and peace conditions throughout these, I think, 26 different societies. And you see the biggest effect actually between war and peace. So war, more dominant, peace, less dominant. In these societies, Netherlands, Croatia, Australia, but you see more of them everywhere. And the red line is where there's no difference between the conditions. So there our manipulation doesn't work. And you see that there's only really two societies, Nigeria and Russia, where we find a null effect. So it seems to work. Go back to this sort of evolutionary leadership theory. When you activate a certain context, like war, people will respond by forming a prototype of a leader that helps them navigate through this crisis or threat. And that's different from a situation of peace or whatever. Now, the only correlation we could find with something like well, we haven't done it systematically with all these ecological predictors, but we did find a correlation with military expenditure. That those societies, and this is the main effect, those societies that spend more of their GDP on equipment, military equipment, whatever, they also have a stronger preference for a more dominant leader. This is correlations, so what the causation is, I'm not so sure. And also we found, you may be familiar with these individual difference variables, but those individuals who are higher in social dominance orientation and in right-wing authoritarianism also are more likely to prefer a more dominant looking leader as a main effect. Okay, this is, did you already present these data here?
No.
Oh, okay. So we did some of our data sampling in the Ukraine just after the war there started, because we were interested to see, hey, in a real world conflict, is there also a shift in preferences towards a more sort of dominant leader, as opposed to a less dominant, warmer leader? I think generally the result is yes, there is. That's what we found in the first wave. And in the second wave, we also asked people to think about a situation of peace. So think about your country, Ukraine, being in peace now. Well, how does that change your perception of an ideal leader? And then the difference that we found is that, and this is the baseline, is compared to the situation you're at now in war. So you find that when people think about peace, slightly stronger preference for a more competent leader, slightly stronger preference for a warmer leader, but a lesser preference for a more dominant leader when thinking about peace in a real world conflict situation. So that more or less confirms our hypothesis in a real world conflict. Okay, I can talk about sex ratios, but I don't want to occupy your time. I can also open it for discussion. What do you think, Honorata?
Well, now we have a new leader. So
You changed halfway through the.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
we are
great.
pretty
Okay.
participative.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I definitely have a question on this, so
Yeah.
maybe you want to briefly, if that's okay with everyone?
Yeah.
On the sex ratio.
Yeah.
You're the leader.
Yeah, you're the leader now,
Okay.
so you can do the sex ratios.
I can do this. Okay. Okay. So countries vary in sex ratios. So sex ratios is basically the proportion of men relative to women in society, and there's different types. You have the operant sex ratio is the proportion of sexually reproducing adults, male adults versus female adults in a population. So you have more narrow kind of things. But anyways, sex ratios vary between countries. What do they have to do with leadership? So that was the question that we try to address here. Sex ratios in biology is really important. I don't know if you consider that, but if you go to Artis and you see like a chimp population or a bonobo or a gorilla or a meerkat, whatever, it matters how many females to males there are in the population about how their social system works. And so if you take away a couple of males or females and it changes the sex ratio, also the group dynamics changes very dramatically. So it's not so strange to think that in humans it may work the same way. But does it work also in these large-scale populations that we're currently living? Okay, so we varied the sex ratios in vignettes, where we gave people a vignette that in their society, when you walk outside the door, you mostly see women. When you're going for a job, you're mostly with female candidates. When you, I don't know, go into the gym, you mostly see females, not that many males. So we primed people with lots of information that there was a male biased or a female biased sex ratio within their society. And then we asked the question the same way as we did before: who do you vote for as your president of your country when you have read that scenario? And we also mapped it onto some of the globe data. And by and large, what we found was that in societies where people are believed, are made to think that there are lots of men, they have a stronger preference for what we call a stronger leader, a more dominant leader, versus a situation where there's a female biased society. There's still a stronger preference for a strong leader, but it's not as great compared to the control condition. That's the sort of neutral condition. And we found it in 4 different studies. And we also found it in an archival data set with the globe. So why is that? When we looked at some of the mediation mechanisms, it seemed to be that people in a male biased society were feeling vulnerable. They were feeling threatened, both men and women, but for different reasons, interestingly. So when you're a woman and you're faced with lots of men, I mean, this is sexual selection theory, you may be worried about your reproductive decision making, being hindered by so many men being for your attention, whatever. So, and for men, of course, in a male biased sex ratios, right, it's lots of male competition. intrasexual competition. So maybe this drives these different leadership preferences. And actually, this older study backs that up because Australia, you know, is like a conflict country. Well, lots of English conflicts went there. So they, different counties there have different sex ratios still to this day, based on the selective migration of a lot of male convicts to these regions. Now, what did these researchers found? That in counties is there anyone from Australia? Okay, in counties that have a highly male bias sex ratio, to this day, the male bias sex ratio dating back through the 17th century, 18th century, today there is less gender equality, more women working at home, less women working outdoors, fewer women in political positions of higher status and whatever. And so there seems to be something going on there. So about the link between sex ratios and cultural traits. Shall I leave it here?
Whatever you prefer. Yeah.
Yeah, no, but there may be questions. And then you can also look at different, you can pit disease against war, and we did that in some of the other studies. So, okay.
Well, thank you so much for your fascinating talk. We'll open the floor for questions. And if you're online, please just type it into the chat box and we'll read it out.
Thank you for the presentation. When you were talking about the agricultural use or the reliance on agriculture and the preference for a more authoritarian regime or leader, I was thinking that this does align with a lot of cases that I've seen, including my own native country.
Which is?
Portugal.
Okay.
So the interesting thing is, I don't think it's so much the case where the ecology of being very reliant on agriculture from the very beginning defined the mentality. But at some point, the isolation within the geographic isolation in Europe led to more traditionalist views. Also, the Catholic influence led to more traditionalist views, which then created more authoritarian perspective, which then led to the consolidation and more conservative approach to let's keep things as they are, including the reliance on agriculture and the economic advantage point of let's keep producing and selling the things we do already have. So let's keep the ecology that we have because that's what seems to produce the most value right now and never really change. So it's almost the other way around where politics defines ecology.
Yes. So that's an interesting one because I mean I think I have when I talk about the end here, these are some of the sort of questions indeed. Is that there's obviously also a relationship between political structure, political systems, and ecology. I do think that obviously you can do the studies to see if it's true. So ideally you have ecology as a predictor in the past, a political system as an outcome in the future, because that gets around this. I mean, Portugal, I think what you talk about, I think pretty much sort of explains Sparta in a way as being insulated more or less, and not so open to influences externally. So traditionalism is more important, as opposed to Athens, where there's sort of outward looking trading is important, and that also shapes culture to a certain extent. But these are some of the things that we're actually trying to currently study. So, for example, how about migrants? So the Netherlands is like a migrant country, more or less. It has been for many centuries. But how quickly do these CLIs change when people move from one society to another? Do they bring their CLI with them from like an honor culture to a dignity culture? Or I don't know if you're familiar with these concepts, but yeah, so that's one of the questions that we're trying to answer. Anyways, yeah.
Dan, and then Jakob.
Thank you very much. This is interesting. And my question is Yeah, maybe you have heard this question quite sometimes. For me, your explanation, for example, regarding the gazelle and the eating disorders is quite convincing. But when it comes to culture, it's a bit. So, for example, now I see that Europe has never been this close to war, and the leaders who seem to be winning this week are like Giorgia Meloni, who's female, the AfD co-chair, who's also Marine Le Pen, so like not typically dominant male leaders, or also as for the other example that Cuba is also like Athens,
Right.
and it's not really well, in the past decade it wasn't, about past century it wasn't the most democratic country. So what I see is that these evolutionary theories in terms of culture are to me not the most convincing, but it's subjective. But I don't know if it's always so I don't know if it's falsifiable. I don't know if it's something that for example, small scale societies that we can observe now are probably those small scale societies that survived colonization. So the cultures are the more similar to the colonizers' culture,
Right.
or also culture is something really language related. So comparing it to animals, like humans to animals. So this is my first question. What's your answers to these things? And the other, that if we assume that all these evolutionary things are right, or they are proven, let's say, then what do they add to the cultural explanation? So to me, culture is something that it's difficult to change, but still with an education system, with other laws, with anything, you can have some impact on it. But evolution, as far as I know, like genetic engineering is not so developed. So it's something that you cannot really use for interventions, for example.
Right. Oh, okay. Yeah. That's interesting. I mean, there's lots of questions in your question. So, okay. So, I mean, let's first look at the politics in Europe. So that's an interesting one because you started with and I think that's interesting. Yes, you do see women emerging as leaders, even despite Europe being at war, or parts of Europe being at war. I would say they are associated generally with right-wing parties. So the embodiment of dominance in a political party is, I think, a genuine thing that's going on in Europe. So we want a vote for a right-wing party is a vote for is a vote of somebody who is threatened, who feels anxious, and feels that their goals are best served by voting for a right-wing party rather than a liberal or left-wing party. Generally speaking, I mean, you are the experts on this, so maybe I shouldn't. And there's exceptions, I think, but Meloni, of course, Thatcher, lots of examples of women who emerge, but they emerge from parties that are traditional, conservative, right-wing, and so I don't think it totally undermines our data. As for the other things, I mean, if you look at this sort of, if you look at the Australian, you could say, okay, in Australia, gender equality is a thing. It's a concern of many people. They talk about the jock culture and the sort of maybe toxic masculinity that's happening in Australia in politics and in business. And you can say, yeah, we need to change that, which is fine. I think that needs to be done. But seeing that it's rooted in some historical event like that has to do something with a shift in sex ratios happening very quickly over time when these ships with these prisoners, to me, is valuable in a way, and it's valuable knowledge, because it means that if you change the ecology, or maybe even the perception of ecology, it may have some consequences down the line for how we think about men and women in traditional roles, or opportunities for women in politics and business. And so, yeah, maybe it's not the sort of direct button that you want to switch on when you want to promote women's rights or whatever, but knowing that there is some sort of deeper logic to why certain countries are gender unequal based on some historical events, whatever, I think. Yeah, I think it's still valuable, but yeah.
And we have Jakob and then Heidi.
Yeah, I was just wondering, conflict is still a super abstract construct, and there's a lot of variation in conflict. So I was wondering, what specific aspects do you think are related to this preference for dominance? Because I do know some of the work, for example, on the glass cliff, so that women in crisis situation perform worse as CEOs. But if you actually look at the data, that's only because they are preferred in situations where the company is doing so badly that there's almost no way to save the company. In those situations, people prefer stereotypically more female leaders. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that's okay. So, yeah. I mean, it's good that you not every conflict is the same, and so I'm reminded of a study by a colleague that you probably know, Lasse Lausen and Michael Bank-Peterson. You know that.
Lasse was here.
Oh, Lasse was here. Okay, so one of their papers was pitting war against a situation where you had a government that was corrupt, essentially. So either it was a conflict, like an external conflict, or you had a conflict with your leaders, with the government, who would exploit your resources, would take your taxes and not pay them and return them, whatever. And there, at that type of conflict within a society, you saw actually preference moving away from dominant leaders. Because a dominant leader may be good in an aggressive war, but if they can exploit you, then maybe you don't want them. So I think it's really good to be quite clear about how you define and operationalize conflict. So within group conflict and between group may be totally different, activating a totally different psychology. Yes, and as regard to the glass cliff, does that exist? I mean, it's a sexy story. I mean, people say, oh yeah, I'm not convinced. No, and there's been at least one bigger paper in Leadership Quarterly, maybe 2 or 3 years ago, that doesn't find any evidence for the glass cliff effect. And what I think is going on, this is not about women and leadership, but this is like a classic, you have in game theory, you have a principle that says win, stay, lose, change. So if you win, you stick with and if you lose, you try something else. So I think that's what's going on. So if you repeatedly fail with a particular kind of a prototype of a leader, then you go for something else. But it could be a dwarf or a woman or well, I don't want that, but yeah, it could be anything that is different.
Maybe but wouldn't that then actually be an argument for the glass cliff existing? If the societal structure where you have predominantly male leaders as positions, if you then change, you switch automatically rather to female leaders, right?
Yeah, it could also be somebody with a migrant background, so it's not specific to women. It's just so it's a broader phenomenon. Yeah, but not tied specifically to male, female. I don't think that person.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the Conservative Party. They seem to be applying that rule all the time. Like, things go bad, let's take a woman. Things go even worse, let's take another woman. Goes even worse, let's take an Indian guy.
Let's take an Indian as Sunak. Yeah, he's actually the son of my GP.
Yeah, so now next time we're going back to the white males.
No, so that's it.
I had a lot of different questions, but I think I had a question that was actually unrelated to what you presented.
Sorry, what is that?
Unrelated to what you presented.
Well, yeah, why not? You have to pay for those sessions, guys.
Okay, well, I'll start to. So I remember reading through some of the literature on leadership and followership a few years ago, and some of the or it was yours, and there was a distinction being made between dominant leadership type and a different leadership type, and the one based on prestige.
Yeah.
But there was very little work on this. And
Yeah.
so my question is, has this developed and how is it developed?
Yeah, so I put this on. This is like the sort of theoretical model that we're actually currently testing, and that's so. This is like a classic distinction in sort of evolutionary psychology, anthropology between dominance and prestige as two different status systems. So dominance is a status system based on coercion, intimidation, and it's what we share with many other group living animals. And then prestige is a system where status is given, not taken. It's granted based on your competence and your generosity. And that's typical human. And that's where you see the transition towards sort of hunter-gatherers, egalitarian hunter-gatherer. You see move away from dominance towards prestige. Christopher Byrne, do you know his work, Hierarchy of the Forest?
Yeah.
That's what he describes this transition. So actually we have now some data with some primatologists showing that prestige actually is also a currency in non-human primates.
Mm.
So it's not totally exclusively. And so that's happening at the moment. So do we see prestige in other animals, non-human animals? And the other is what's happening is, well, what are the components of prestige? Because it seems to be quite a bin term. So it's competence maybe, but also warmth, generosity, pro-sociality, two different things. So yeah, that's something that's happening at the moment. And the argument that we have in this paper is, well, dominance may be an agonistic kind of strategy. It's like status that you take because you are the top guy, the alpha, you can bully others. But here we try to argue that dominance is also a prestige attribute in times of war. You want an aggressive leader, somebody who might turn against you. Okay, we take that risk. But hey, at least he's now fine for our party in this conflict, and he's tough on his outgroups essentially. So dominance as being a prestige-based attribute, and some actually argue that we should get rid of the dominance and prestige in leadership and say everything is prestige in humans. Because pure dominance, you don't get very far in any human group because they'll kill you essentially very quickly.
Okay, anyone have one last question? We have time for a short one.
Here we have
Yeah.
a question from
From-
online. Let's maybe start with the last one.
The last one?
Yes.
Okay, so have somebody checked the Englehart's variable survival versus self-expression? And are some of the data you have mentioned open and publicly available to check further hypotheses?
Yeah, sure. Yes, Engelhart, that's an interesting. So I've looked at that. Yeah, that's also a cross-cultural data set.
Mhm.
Yeah, World
Engelhart,
Values Survey. That's a
that's the World Value Survey.
Yes.
Yeah, I think. We used the Globe data set so far, but I think some of the work, certainly on culture and psychology, comes from the World Values Survey. That's England's, yeah. And there's also a European version of it, the European Value Survey. Yeah, we haven't looked at the variables from those databases. Are there any leadership questions? Yeah, there are leadership questions.
Well, not exactly, maybe would, add something, but there could be proxies there that they.
And it's political leadership. It's like I'm happy for a politician who doesn't pay service to government or something, who doesn't.
Yeah, so a
something
leader
like
who
that.
doesn't care about the parliament.
Would be interesting to test some of these hypotheses with that data set. Yeah. anyone who wants to work on that with me.
Great. Well, that's all we have time for today. So thank you again.
Thank you.
As with every speaker at the Hot Politics Lab, you get one of our mugs.
Is that right? The pandemic teacher mug?
No, the hot politics.
Oh, the hot politics. Oh, wow.
Yes.
I could take that on the train. Is that
Yeah.
excellent? Thank you very much.
Next week, we have Bram Zizou from the UvA. So that's on June 14th. And then the 21st, we don't have a meeting. We'll come back on the 28th for our last meeting of the academic year with Clara Reimann, who's sitting right there.
Rangman, yeah, but.
Yes. And Josh Gilmore. So see you then.